Recording now, and we're going to get ready to begin. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat anytime. Professor Cox is here. She's going to help us make sure we don't miss any questions. And at the end, we'll have time for discussion. So thank you for being with us. As we talk about true crime, we're very excited to be discussing this topic this semester. We were inspired last semester to make this the focus of our webinar series. So we're glad that you're all here and we're ready to get started. So first I'll introduce myself. My name is Allegra Davis Hanna. That's me on the right with the glasses. I teach English for the Connect campus and I'm the department chair for English and Humanities.
And I'm Misty Wilson-Mertens. My computer has 3 cords to get power. It's a very, very complicated, strange setup. Sorry it took so long. I teach history and I am the chair of history, government, and sociology.
Luckily, she doesn't teach anything to do with computers.
Tech.
Yeah. All right. So the first thing we want to make sure everyone is aware of, whether you're watching this live or recording, is that obviously this is a webinar about true crime, which means we will be discussing crime and occasionally we will be discussing things that are violent, things that have to do with murder. So we're obviously not going to be gruesome or graphic or explicit, but you know, everyone has a different threshold for that. So be prepared, and if you need to take a break or log off, please feel free to do that. We don't want this webinar to upset anyone. All right, so let's start with defining the genre. I'm pretty sure most of us are familiar, but true crime is nonfiction. It's a genre of literature, podcasts, film, or TV shows that examines an actual crime and describes the action of the people involved. Sometimes it focuses on the victim, sometimes the suspect, sometimes the investigator, sometimes a combination therein. But it's a true story of a true crime, and hence the name, True Crime.
So is true crime popular, Allegra?
I don't know. What do you think? Turn on Netflix. You know what I mean?
Open a podcast app.
There's a boom right now. So I feel like it's been a thing, especially since I was a kid, because I was a kid in the 90s. But there's a big time boom right now. And that was created by 3 things that came out within about 8 months of each other. The podcast Serial, which is produced by some NPR podcasters. And that was about the murder of Hae Min Lee that took place in 1999. A show called Jinx, and that's a documentary on HBO where they actually got a person to confess unbeknownst to them on camera. And it's just very bizarre. And then Making a Murderer, which is probably the thing most seen by most people, is a documentary on Netflix. About a person wrongfully convicted of murder who was then investigated for another. So those 3 things were very interesting, very much discussed, kind of created a new boom in true crime. And then since then, we've had several reasons that fed into that. Podcasts became super popular, and therefore true crime podcasts kind of fed the flames here. We have more streaming services, so we have more access to more content. Turn on a streaming service, literally any single one. I tried it last night. I looked at HBO, I looked at Hulu, I looked at Netflix, I looked at Paramount, I looked at Peacock, every single one, Discovery Plus, except for Disney.
Oh, wow.
All of them don't just have true crime documentary, but they feature them prominently. Yeah, Disney's got to get into the true crime. And I don't know. I don't think they're going to do that. Please don't. No. They're also pretty cheap to make. So if you think about the cost of making an Avengers movie versus the cost of making a documentary where you interview 5 or 6 people and use a bunch of footage, they're pretty cheap to make. And they're pretty fast to make relative to, a feature film. And then we all just had more time to watch stuff, which means that they're going to create more stuff and churn it out because of the pandemic.
It also was one of the only types of media that could be made during the pandemic because you didn't need actors and makeup crews and all of that kind of stuff.
Right, you just could create a documentary using existing footage and maybe a couple interviews. Absolutely. So we're in a boom, but It's not new.
Nothing's ever new.
Well, I mean, podcasts are new.
Are they? Because aren't they just repackaged radio?
This radio. Never mind. Okay. So as early as the 1500s, people became really invested in true crime. There were leaflets, little pamphlets that they passed out and sold. People wrote songs about court cases. People attended court trials, wrote them up, and sold the trial accounts. And even as far back as the 1500s, we were disproportionately fascinated with crimes committed by women, crimes that were domestic related, and anything just bizarre, brutal, or having to do with people who were otherwise already famous.
You know, in some ways, I think we can even go beyond the 1500s, because if you think about the Bible, the first story is God made light, right? And then we have Adam and Eve. And then what's the next thing that happens? Cain and Abel.
I felt like I was in a Bible study quiz. Okay.
So, I mean, right off the bat.
Yeah. We were interested in the crimes. In the 1800s, this is like, Charles Dickens times. So we had true crime literature, novels. Are you laughing at me saying
Charles Dickens?
Yeah,
times.
you're okay, fine. You use history, I'll use literature as reference points. And that's when we really started seeing people start talking about criminal justice reform and the conditions in prisons, which were especially heinous in the 1800s. They also started focusing not just on the investigation, but also sometimes on the victims and what happened to them. And then once we got into the 18 to 1900s, that's when we started making a distinction between prestigious true crime and kind of trashy true crime. So they call it highbrow and lowbrow, but it's kind of like the difference between HBO documentary on Robert Durst versus the show Snapped on Lifetime.
Sure.
You've seen Snapped?
I know it.
So it's just about women who snap, right? So they're all legitimate forms of storytelling, but there's a distinction in some people's mind between fancy true crime and, trashy true crime. And that exists from the 1800s. Now you're probably going to tell us about some crazy thing that happened in history, is my guess. Nope, not
I'm
yet.
not.
Not yet. It's my turn. Okay. So before we talk any further, we just want to separate a few things. The first is that a lot of true crime reporting comes from journalistic media. So journalistic media are people whose duty is to report the news. So that's newspapers, news channels like NBC News, and 24-hour news channels like CNN. They are considered kind of a public utility. They serve the public. So DFW, News at 5 p.m., the Dallas Morning News, CNN, the NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, all of those things are considered serving the public good.
Because you should know what's going on in your home community.
Right. They're fulfilling a duty of keeping you informed. So you need to know if there's a fire. You need to know if there's a crazy killer on the loose. You need to know if a lion has escaped from the zoo. You need to know what the statistics are, what the mayor's doing, what the election's happening. So that's keeping the public informed. But the truth is all media outlets, including entertainment media, are motivated at least partially by ratings, sales, and readership. Especially online, they're interested in clicks and how much time your eyes spend on a certain page. So there's a little confusion sometimes about the motive of a particular piece of content. Is it designed to inform you? So that would be, here's information that you need to know to live in the civilization. Is it to entertain you, which is to draw your attention, amuse you, pass the time, or is it to persuade you to perhaps change your vote or change the way you behave?
Or join an organization like the Innocence Project or something like
Exactly. So sometimes, let's think about an episode of Dateline, which is an hour-long news magazine, usually about a certain crime. That's a news organization that puts it together. How much do I need to know about a murder that happened in Massachusetts in 1987 as public good? And how much are they milking that for entertainment value?
Right. Is it really about informing you, or is it about selling commercial spots?
Exactly. So, and sometimes it is legitimate news, right? but there's always a line where they cross over and say, hey, this is getting a lot of attention. Let's promote it. Let's make a 2-hour special. Let's put it on the news every day. Now you're going to tell us about something weird in history.
So really and truly, none of this is new. But as we go through this, I want you guys to be thinking about what was the point of this information being shared again? Was it to inform, to sell you something, or was it to persuade you? So we're starting off really early here in American history in Jamestown. I'm just going to let you guys know that we do not teach Jamestown appropriately in K through 12. I'm going to make it sound like it was a little rough and it was kind of a hard life. No, it was awful. Of the first 500 settlers that came, 60 lived over a year.
Wait. 500 came and 60 survived.
Yes. Now, a lot of that is starvation and disease, but some of it is murder.
Okay. How much murder?
More than I would like to admit.
Okay.
So the first big crime in the Americas that we're going to talk about comes from Jamestown, and it's during the starving time, which is 1609 to 1610. A man murdered his pregnant wife and then ate her because he was starving. And what you're seeing on the screen here is a reconstruction of a skull that was a victim of one of these crimes. Now, some of the starving time is also just digging up bodies and eating the recently dead that had died of starvation.
No.
But then people are writing about this, and they are truly writing to inform. If I'm in Jamestown and I'm living through this, I'm going to write back home telling my cousin, do not come here. Stay where you're at.
We're eating each other. Please.
Yes, things are bad. Send food.
Right, but don't come.
Okay. So this really truly is to inform. And that picture is taken from National Geographic. Just
I'm
in
changing.
Case you were interested.
I'm changing the slide now.
All right, we're going to skip ahead just a little bit to the murder of Helen Jewett. Helen Jewett was a fairly well-known prostitute in New York City.
Sex worker.
Well, I'm using the term of the time. She was murdered by one of her clients in a pretty gruesome way. And her client was fairly wealthy. So we have all the necessary ingredients there for a really sensational story.
Gruesome, wealthy, well-known people. Okay.
So the New York Herald is a relatively new newspaper, and their editor realized that if he could put this on the front page, he would sell lots of newspapers. And so he did that almost every day for a few months. They covered the crime, the search for the killer, interviews with the killer's friends and family, interviews with the victim's friends and family, and then they covered the trial. So from start to finish, this was a media circus, a very early 1800s media circus. And this really begins tabloid journalism in the United States. This coverage was incredibly exaggerated. And then there are some things in these newspapers that are just flat out untrue because people either wanted to be interviewed or the editor wanted to sell a newspaper. But it got better, right, Elijah?
No, it sure didn't. So at the end of that century, there was a different murder, and this was not a person who was well known, but it was a situation that was particularly gruesome. So what the back of this book, because there's a book about this case that I read because I read books, is that 3 discoveries were made in the same day, all related to the same crime. One was somebody's duck pond had turned red with blood. Someone found a torso, and then somewhere else in New York, they found limbs. And that was, so you could see why that would generate public alarm, public interest. So there's, again, a legitimate duty to inform about something dangerous happening. But then, of course, it became scandalous, and we are now, this really fed the fire of those newspaper wars in New York. So this was challenging for the police to solve. So one of the reasons that this was so appealing and interesting to people is there was an in-depth kind of scientific investigation. The New York Police Department had only existed for about 50 years at this point, and they had just started doing things scientifically, like using fingerprints, collecting samples, using ballistics. So that was interesting to people. The circumstances of the murder were interesting to people. But what really fed this was there's 2 newspapers in New York City, the World and the Journal, I believe, and two very famous newspaper owners, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, whose names are still well known today. And they were just trying to outdo each other. So more sensational headline, more sensational picture on the cover, more interviews with people close to the case. Every single day, they were just trying to outdo each other to sell more newspapers. And so again, there's a very small degree to which they're following that duty, and then they're more motivated by sales. This is before the integrity of a newspaper was important. And so they sensationalized, just like the previous case, every aspect, right? The victims, the perpetrators, the solving of the crime, what do the neighbors think? How is this changing New York City? All of those kinds of things. And if you're interested, that the book is really interesting because it's history, newspapers, journalism, science. It's a lot of things in that book. We're going to jump ahead quite a bit here, right?
Right. One of the reasons we're jumping ahead so far is from the turn of the century, really up until about 1960, as a nation, our concerns turned outwards rather than inwards. We have the Spanish-American War there, World War I, World War II, and then the Cold War. So it's not that crimes weren't happening during that time. It's just that the press was dominated by these international stories. So there wasn't as much focus on what was happening domestically in each little town. But so that changes.
Yes, that does change. So while we're thinking about world wars, we're maybe not as fascinated by individual crimes. That does make sense. In 1959, there was the murder of an entire family, the Clutter family, in very rural Holcomb, Kansas. They're a farm town, and this was a family of farmers. And so an author, Truman Capote, heard about this story, just like in a very brief news snippet, became very interested in it. He and his best friend, Harper Lee wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. They went to Kansas. They planned to stay very brief, to do a little investigation, ask a few questions, maybe write one story for the New Yorker or the New York Times. But they ended up staying for years. They took thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of notes. Truman Capote got so in-depth and involved in the story. He didn't become friends with any of them, but he got to know all of them personally. And so the book itself, which is still kind of a well-known piece of literature, has three stories. The story of the murderers, the story of the Clutter family, and the story of the community and how it impacted the community, and how the investigation was done and how the police were impacted. So there's three stories there. And this was a new style of book. So the book is true. It's true crime. It originally appeared as a series of articles in the New York Times. So it was newspaper stories, feature pieces, but it was being written as it happened, as opposed to investigated and written about after the fact. And that's called new journalism. But essentially what he did is he took true crime reporting and he turned it into a narrative. So if you read this book, you read it and it feels like you're reading a novel as opposed to a news article. So he really used storytelling to put the story together, even though it's a true story. And that's very common now. There's dozens, hundreds of books that come out every year that are written as kind of nonfiction novels, but this is one of the very first, and definitely the first that's about true crime. And so this book came out, so the articles came out, the book came out, then they made a movie of the events in the book in the 60s. And so this was a very, very, very well-known case. The murderers, the Clutter family, the investigators, the police, they were all kind of famous for several years.
Yeah, that's also kind of what podcasts do now, isn't it?
Yes.
They insert themselves into the story as they solve it.
Yes, and that's exactly what lots of podcasts do. And this is another example of a big, long story about one single case.
So jumping ahead just a little bit, we're going to get into the golden age of serial killers. So we have what historians refer to as a long decade here. It actually starts in 1967, 68, and then continues to the 80s. This is a time when serial killers became recognized. We started using that term. But there were some things in America that were happening that both, one, made serial killing easier, and two, made it easier to keep up with the story. So one of the first things that scholars point to that made serial killing easier was the development of the highway system. So that's something built in the 1950s and 60s, and then by the 1970s and 80s, we have killers using it to hunt and stalk and kill victims. Stories also became more nationalized in a way we hadn't seen before. There's a new Americanization. If you guys think about TV reporters, anchors, somebody like Walter Cronkite tried very hard to have a quote-unquote American accent. You didn't want to be listening to the news and hear a New York accent or a Southern accent. So all of our news became Americanized. It's generic America rather than these local things. But when I hear it in that generic American accent, it makes it feel like it happened down the street from me, not 10 states away.
Mm-hmm.
So then I'm more interested in the news because it feels local. All right, so the FBI is going to form the Behavioral Science Unit in 1971. Them just forming that unit alone is going to increase interest in what they're doing. And that's going to also make it profitable to sell stories about what they're doing.
I see.
And so we're going to see media transform a little bit here. We're going to have newspaper reports that we've always had. We have a whole magazine that develops, True Detective Magazine, that's going to follow these cases, and then some older ones. Made for TV movies, memoirs, and books come out. And you guys probably today are familiar with all 4 of those mugshots that I have up there. These cases become so well known that even almost 40 years later, we can name who these people are. And just in case you didn't know, we have Ramirez there, Manson, John Wayne Gacy, and Ted Bundy.
I didn't know Charles Manson was that short.
He's tiny.
Yeah.
He's tiny. So things change again.
I don't want to look at their faces anymore.
Yeah.
So now we're in the 90s, and that's really, if the 70s and 80s are the golden age of serial killers, the 90s is the golden age of true crime. For some reason, well, for many reasons, the crimes committed in the 90s are of particular interest to people. I don't know if it's generational. So these are all things that happened when you and I were kids. And so we have some kind of sense of nostalgia for them, or if they're just historical circumstances. But of course, we have the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Of course, O.J. Simpson famously accused and acquitted of those murders. Murders of famous musicians, Selena, Tupac, and Biggie. This was famous in Texas, not as much nationally, but 2 military cadets in a love triangle situation conspired to murder someone. That happened in Crowley. John Benet Ramsey, which I think everyone is familiar with. The Menendez family, which I think everyone is familiar with. Darlie Routier was convicted of killing her children. And she is one of 6 women in Texas on death row. And then the murder of Gianni Versace. And so these cases all brought on obsessive, ceaseless, brutal news coverage. Every aspect of every crime, every person even marginally involved in these cases was interviewed, stalked by the media, reported on, news specials. It was like paparazzi, but for crime. And so people were being followed. People, were being filmed in cemeteries, mourning people's lives. In 1991 is when Court TV started. So that's when we started being able to watch every single minute of every famous court case. And then this is when we really started trial. I mean, ever since true crime existed, people made judgments after reading reports, so they did it or they didn't do it. But because we had so much footage following these people around, we really started saying, oh, she did it or she didn't do it. Look at the way she's behaving. So we started analyzing people's affect, their facial expressions, their body language, their speech patterns. And so we said, oh, I can tell she's a murderer. Look at her face, right?
Did she cry enough? Did she cry too much?
Does he look creepy? All those kinds of things. Yeah. We had, all these Dateline specials, and we had them in the 90s and we have them now, right? 10 years later, looking back at John Benet Ramsey, 15 years later, 20 years later. So we have retrospectives that are still happening. And so they are quote unquote informing us, but news media just ran away with these because they were so appealing. All these cases have a few things in common. Most of these cases involve wealthy people. Some of these cases involve famous people. Some of them are particularly gruesome or very challenging to solve. In the case of like the Menendez brothers, it was a very wealthy family, but it was the big question of how could two brothers kill their own parents? How could a person, kill their own children? All kinds of questions like that. And you'll see that there's asterisks next to 3 of these cases. I was just doing research for this episode, and all 3 of those killers are in the same unit in the same prison in Texas. So,
trivia.
Yeah, the person who killed Selena, the female Texas cadet, and then Darlie Routier all in the same prison. So there you go. There's your murder trivia. So that's the 90s. The next decade is very different.
Something happened at the beginning of the 2000s.
Yes, it did. And so we have some notable cases. These names are probably less familiar than the names on the previous slide. There may be some on here you've never heard of. There may be some on here that you have heard of. But why were there fewer high-profile cases, and why were these cases less of a focus for people?
If we go back to our earlier hypothesis that when there's great international events, we focus outwards rather than inwards, 9/11 focused our attention outwards. So it's really hard to pierce through that for us to have national level consciousness of cases. So these are cases that did pierce through that, but they were not as tabloidy as the 1990s were, maybe because we thought we had more important things to be worried about.
Yeah, and 9/11,
the invasion of Iraq.
The invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, so we're involved in 2 wars. We have national conversations about both terrorism and enhanced interrogation. So lots of big news stories that are national, of a broader scope. And so fewer cases kind of rose to the surface of public awareness. And all of these were less doggedly investigated than the things that we discussed in the 90s. Of these, to me, Amanda Knox is probably the one that got the most attention. But I was also paying attention to that, so I don't know if that's kind of my bias. Up until we get into the 2015 kind of boom in true crime, these are all famous cases. Casey Anthony was ceaselessly, obsessively covered in the news media. Her affect was tried in the media. There were some cases with kind of paparazzi-like reporting, but it was just to a much lesser degree. And so we did end up at the end of this time period fixating really on older crimes. So serial was about a crime that happened in the 90s. Making a Murderer was about a crime that happened earlier in the decade. So we weren't following stories as they unfolded. We were looking for maybe better, richer stories, things that are more interesting to pay attention to. And that brings us back to this same slide, to this boom that has erupted in the media of true crime. So Making a Murderer, Jinx, Serial came out, boom, boom, boom. And so suddenly everybody became more interested. And there are plenty of people who were always interested in these stories, but it's everywhere now. So before we talk about today, you know, of course, there's always been crime. There's always been murder. There have always been mysteries. But you kind of have to interrogate why certain things are what we're drawn to and why others are things that we don't talk about as much. So does it have to do with our fears? For instance, in the 70s and 80s, people were very afraid of people breaking into their homes.
Right.
Strangers assaulting and killing them the way serial killers were doing.
And there was all this media about something called a super predator.
Yes. You know, why are murders by women more fascinating? Probably because we have cultural norms where women are less violent, less angry, less likely, and so it betrays our notion of what it means to be a woman. Maybe that's why, you know. And we're going to have a webinar later in the semester where we really investigate these questions sociologically. Why are we interested in certain things? In the 90s, we were obsessed with cases that involved wealth and fame, right? O.J. Simpson, John Benet Ramsey. In the 2010s, we were really interested in cases that were focused on almost the opposite, marginalized people, right? Hae Min Lee was just a high school Asian high school teenager. The accused murderers, Adnan Syed. Making a Murderer is about someone who, you know, lives in poverty, definitely not wealthy, famous. So that to me is kind of the opposite. I don't know why, right? Are we interested? Do we just now, are we sick of hearing stories only about rich, wealthy people? Like, what changed in our consciousness to make us more interested in different kinds of stories? And then what are we interested in now, right? What kinds of stories are we obsessed with now, which we're going to talk about? But if you think about the last 2 or 3 years, the true crime stories that you're most familiar with, what would you say?
So for sure, Gabby Petito from
Yes, Ball. Gabby Petito.
Last 2 or 3 years. Robert Durst.
Yeah.
I honestly can't think of another one in the last 2 or 3 years that I'm familiar with, but I don't consume a lot of this media.
That's true. You haven't.
I'm a bad test case.
So
if I've heard about them, they're a big deal.
These are all from the last
Tiger King
2 years. And so this is just the things that I thought of from the top of my head. And again, by looking at all of the streaming services I could. And this is just the last 2 years. So since COVID, basically, these things have all come out. Some of these are podcasts. Some of these are HBO documentaries. Some of these are Netflix documentaries. You'll see some of them are from Hulu. And so the question is, what patterns do we see? What kinds of things are we now fascinated by? And I would say that really what people are interested in is just a good original kind of story, right? We have things here that are about cults. So several things on the screen are about NXIVM, the cult organization. I don't know if we're calling it a cult. I certainly would. So we had a couple new things about Heaven's Gate, which is a cult from the 90s. Some other things up here from the 90s, like the story of Lorena Bobbitt. I'll Be Gone in the Dark is a serial killer from 70s. The Fire Festival, that's a whole different kind of crime, right? That's fraud.
Theranos is fraud.
Theranos is fraud. So we had The Dropout, The Inventor, Bad Blood, lots of obsession with Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. The Sackler family, Purdue Pharma, that has to do with the opioid crisis. And then, of course, Dr. Death, which is murder, but in a kind of a different context.
And these aren't even the podcasts, right? These are just...
Well, Dr. Death is the podcast. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a whole spectrum of things. I mean, one of these is about an art gallery robbery, right? But they're just, I think, lots of companies, organizations, media outlets are just better at putting these together and packaging them in a way, just like Truman Capote did, where now it's about the story. It's the narrative. It's the characters. It's the arc of the story. So why were we caring about Tiger King?
Right.
Because it's just fascinatingly bizarre, right? But that's a different reason than why we cared about Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. I guess that's also fascinatingly bizarre. But there's just weirdos in those stories, right? People unlike people we'd ever met in our lives. So the other thing that you're going to notice here is that some of these are not documentaries. So Dope Sick and Dr. Death, starring the guy from Dawson's Creek. What's his name?
I have no idea.
Joshua Jackson. Some
Why
of these
would I know that?
are, you wouldn't know that. Some of these are dramatized versions of true crime. And so just like Professor Mertens was saying earlier, when we started to have made-for-TV movies, those were also dramatized versions. So we have actors portraying those things. And to be honest with you, since I put this slide together earlier this week, Netflix came out with Catching Killers Season 2, which is about catching serial killers, Inventing Anna, which is about Anna Delvey, who is also like a fraud case that's very fascinating. So these are coming out like every week.
So
right?
We're already outdated, and you put this
We're
together 2 days ago.
2 days ago, yes.
That's a lot.
Yes.
So if you're interested in true crime, you can definitely spend hours and hours down this.
You can do this
rabbit hole.
And this is just from streaming, right? So this isn't including every week there's an episode of Dateline, every week there's an episode of 2020.
Or Anne Rule books or
yeah,
whatever else you want to go find.
But there might be such a thing as consuming too much true crime.
So I think you should think about this as what's in our media, what are we paying attention to, and what stories are we really focusing on? Because that's going to help us inform some of this conversation we're going to have in a minute about how much is too much. So last fall, there was a story on CNN, Fox News,
everything,
MSNBC,
everything.
National coverage. Look at this timeline. The whole case is from September to October. And I feel like I know so much about this case, and I wasn't really even following it.
Yeah, so part of that is because it was unfolding in real time, right? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that the news broke that a crime had occurred, right? It was the news broke that there was a mystery, right? We think a crime might have occurred. And so really from September through October,
every single day,
sometimes
hours
day.
By hour.
I mean, and we're talking about CNN, which is a national news organization, broadcasting live from this Brian Laundrie's front yard. You know what I mean? So very focused attention on this particular case, partially because it was unfolding in real time and there was something new every day. So it became a true crime soap opera because there was a new development, whether the media had to go dredge up some kind of new fact every single day. So if you turned on the news today, there was a new piece of information. And so people became very, very invested in the story.
So it was happening in the 1800s in newspapers day by day. We are doing day by day via television.
Yes, exactly. And that's not even to get into the kinds of things that were happening on social media, the people who were almost joyous on TikTok because they got to talk about this all the time. And the posts on social media drove this even more. So we can all agree that it was an outsized interest. So it's a horrible crime. It is something that we have every reason to be interested in, but it got a lot of attention.
This is one missing person.
Right.
Not that that's not a horrible tragedy.
But it was a single crime.
Yes.
And so there's lots of reasons why we gave this so much attention. One is they were already, I don't know if famous is the right word, but they were social media influencers. So they were well known. People, a lot of people felt like they could relate to them because they shared a lot of their lives and they had, journals and daily posts. And for older people, they felt like these two are representative of Gen Z. So these people are representative of a whole generation. And that is related to the fact that there was just endless amounts of photos and videos of them. So anytime you talk about them, you can show a different photo or a different video of them on the beach, of them by the canyons. And so that kept it visually different and engaging every day. And people felt like they were part of the investigation. They were looking things up. They were watching all of their old YouTube posts to try and find clues. And there's a lot of armchair detective work happening on all kinds of true crime. But I will say in this one particular case, there was one particular clue that someone did find and they did show to the police and it did help find her remains. Now, does that justify thousands of people all pretending to participate? Maybe not. But in this case, there was, a couple who also filmed everything they did. They also were YouTubers, and they were able to go back through their footage and find something that they had recorded unbeknownst to them. And the other reason is these topics are already in the public discourse. So police body camera footage, already something people are interested in talking about. The police's duty of care for, girls and women, for people who have mental health issues, for domestic violence, all of those questions are things that people were already talking about. Abuse, because there's questions about whether they had an abusive relationship and where parental responsibilities lie. Even if, you're 18 and you're technically an adult, are the parents responsible for turning Brian Laundrie over to the police or making sure certain things don't happen? And, we all want to know how it happened. So just like, for instance, John Benet Ramsey, the surface is perfect, happy family that everyone is aspiring to be more like. And then the truth is kind of the opposite. And so that does draw people's interest when what you think you see is very different from the truth. But there's another reason that we probably can all agree on. The surge of publicity is really related to her race and her age. And there's lots of information and lots of research to justify that.
I think the next point on this slide is a great one for justification of this. How many other people go missing that we never even hear about?
Right. And just in the state of Wyoming, over 700 Indigenous people, mostly girls and women, have disappeared in the last 10 years. Obviously, none of them have gotten this much interest. And there's lots of studies to show that victims who are not of particular race and age don't get as much media coverage. And that's not just the media's fault, because
right, who's consuming the media?
Who's consuming the media, right? Who's driving the usage statistics or the clicks? Who's engaging in things more on social media, on what story? And so all of those factors led to this being obsessive, to a point that just truly had to be disturbing to her family. And there's obviously, when we're talking about a missing person, there is no such thing as too much coverage, right? Because all we're trying to do is find someone. But the tone of the coverage should be appropriate. It
should not have a countdown clock.
Right.
This is how long this person's been missing. Anything could happen at this point.
Right. The speculation we could do without, the guesswork, the social media posts, all those kinds of things are harmful, not helpful. So yes, when we're talking about a missing person, what everybody wants is to see their face as much as possible so that we can be looking for them. But I don't think we need like 4 people on CNN speculating on what could have happened based on their knowledge of the legal system. You know what I mean? Those kinds of things are not helpful.
Or based on watching her YouTube videos for 10 minutes.
Yeah. So before we move on, I just want to say, like, when you watch true crime or consume it, listen to it, watch it, read it, you don't really often think about who it impacts and how. So after Gabby Petito's remains were found, most of the coverage was then no longer helpful at all, right? We're not talking about a missing person anymore. But then it's now a manhunt. So a lot of things in this case were fascinating to people, but a lot of it was probably very harmful to the family, to both families, honestly. And I don't think a lot of people keep that in mind. I mean, if we kept that in mind, I don't think we would have a famous podcast called My Favorite Murder.
Right.
So the tone of that
it doesn't match the weight of the material.
Is jovial, and the focus is murder, right? And so wine and crime, those kinds of things where it's ha 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 ha, let's talk about murder. Like, I know, I've been there, I've listened to those podcasts, but you get a different perspective and you think, what if a member of your family was being discussed on something called My Favorite Murder?
Right.
Like, that's disturbing. So I think that we're responsible for what we're listening to and the tone, and whether we're helping families or just harassing them.
Kind of building off that.
There's my speech.
I think if you're going to consume true crime, you should treat it like cake. It's okay to have cake every now and then.
Sure.
Probably don't have it every single meal.
Yeah.
Maybe space it out a little bit.
And think about where the cake's coming from.
Right.
You know?
So I think if we treated true crime like cake, we wouldn't have things like this, which is a true crime activity book for adults.
This is a lot.
This is a lot. One of the pages in here is a maze. It's like, you know, the kid would do a maze, and it's a maze and you're escaping a serial killer. I don't know if we need that in our lives.
I don't think that we do. I don't think that we need serial killer humor.
No.
No.
So what we're looking at here comes from a study from 2010, but other studies have since validated all of these claims, and you can go look these up. JSTOR is a wonderful place to go find stuff like this. But consuming true crime, and the tipping point is different for every person, can have these negative effects on you. So the first negative effect is it can increase your anxiety or your fear. If you fear going to new places, if you don't go hang out with your friends because you're worried about what could happen to you in a way that is outsized for the actual danger in your life, you probably need to put the books down and put the podcast down and watch something else on TV. Interrupted sleep. This actually has two components. So there are some people that are affected by true crime that have nightmares, but also viewing habits. If you're up on your phone at 3 a.m. and you're watching this on Netflix instead of sleeping, that's also damaging. This one's a little bit tricky, but you can have an inflated sense of danger, but also a very real miscalculation of where the danger is in your life. So you can have this sense of, I'm going to be murdered by a serial killer, and you're going to ignore the red flags that you might be seeing in your relationship that could lead to domestic violence, which is a very real concern. So it does two things there that kind of distort our worldview. This can make you not want to take risks, and some risks might be good. I know I've heard people say, well, I'm never going to do online dating.
Right, or I'm never going to travel, or, yeah.
So, I mean, not that online dating is maybe the greatest experience ever.
Right.
But
there are safe ways to do it.
Yes, exactly. It can increase depression. It can desensitize us to violence. If you are watching shows about murder and you don't have any emotional reaction to that whatsoever, again, treat it like cake. Go eat a vegetable. Go watch a documentary about history. Go watch something about Emily Dickinson. I don't know. Don't watch this. And then also think about the trauma that true crime can cause. It can re-traumatize families and victims. If you are not expecting a story to come on about your cousin, whoever, and then you stumble upon it, that can have a very negative effect on the families. So again, I'm not saying don't consume it. I'm saying think about what you're consuming, why you're consuming it. And again, people do this to make money.
Right.
So think about how what you're doing is contributing to somebody else's bottom line. Now that we've lectured you.
and yeah, I mean, we did lecture you, but I want to go back to this slide with all of the, where did it go? Did I go too fast? I'll be honest with you, Misty, I've watched every single thing that you see on the screen. Right? So this is not about shame, but it is about being thoughtful, right? And being aware of how your actions affect yourself and other people.
And what you're putting into your brain.
Yeah, absolutely. And is it making you smarter, or is it making you terrified? Is it making you a more responsible citizen? Are you more informed? Are you better able to function in society, or are you worse able to function in society? Are you able to have conversations that aren't about crimes?
Right.
You know, those kinds of things. So you do have to think about it. And I think cake is a good analogy, right? If you eat it for every meal,
you're going to have some problems.
You'll have problems, probably starting with the teeth, I think. So I think that's the end of our slides. I don't see questions in the chat. We'll cover the housekeeping stuff, and if you have questions, you're welcome to post them while we're doing that. I know one question you have is, how do I get credit? So Professor Mertens just put into the chat here, and if you're watching this recording in the next 2 days, it will be in the YouTube video description. So you complete that survey. It's going to ask you a few questions. It's going to put your name, your teacher's name, make sure you were kind of paying attention to what you heard. Your instructor gets updates once a month from us about who's attended and completed that survey. And then your instructor will have policies for when credit gets posted and how much it's worth and all of that. Keep in mind, lots of faculty members put extra credit in at the very end of the semester so that you're not counting on it as you submit your grades. Or you submit your
personal experience.
That's me. I put it in at the very end. Very end.
So don't email tomorrow.
Right, because then it's extra. It's not something that you're counting on. Yeah, I'm not putting it in tomorrow. And we do have 3 more coming up.
Right. So our series this time, and I will tell you guys, we pick our series topics off of what you guys suggest. So this was in the news. A student put it in the suggestions. We liked it, and we ran with it. So if there is a topic you want to see discussed, if you want to help us pick our fall series, put that on the sheet and let us know.
I'm pretty sure fall series will have something to do with elections.
I'm pretty sure it will too.
Yeah.
So on March 9th, we are going to have somebody who used to work in a crime lab talk to us about the CSI effect. And if, again, does it make it smarter and make it better, or does it distort our worldview?
Right.
Then Professor Cox and I are going to talk about crooks and killers, not cooks, and about political high crimes. So this isn't all about murder.
Right.
There are other types of true crime.
Mm-hmm.
And then we are going to have a sociologist talk to us about why we're interested in certain cases over others and why certain victims get more attention than others. So we're looking forward to this one.
Yes, we are. Hope you are too. I don't see any questions for us. So we will end the webinar. And thank you for being here with us. And we'll look forward to seeing you on March 9th.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.